Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to welcome you here to the ICRC on the International Day in support of victims of torture. Today is a day that we speak out against the unspeakable. Today is the day we pay respect to those who've endured the unimaginable, to their resilience and to the strength of the human spirit. In my initial years with the ICRC, over 20 years ago, I visited prisons and worked with detainees who had undergone harsh forms of ill treatment. I saw directly the impact torture has not only on the individuals' bodies and minds, but also on their families and entire societies. I saw that those torturing were themselves damaged and deformed by the inhuman acts they committed. I experienced the impact of simple human acts, like warmly shaking a hand or looking someone in the eye, and listening with empathy. Working to prevent torture and working with victims of torture is at the core of our mission here at the ICRC. I believe that in addition to the wide range of activities carried out by the ICRC and others in prisons, moments of profoundly human contact can bring strength. Out of dignified human interaction is born hope and resilience. In our work, we rarely get the opportunity to step back and reflect on a deeper level about why our work matters and what we may learn from others. That's why I was particularly pleased and am very pleased to welcome you here today. Tonight, we are joined by scholars who are at the cutting edge of thinking through issues of torture, pain, and dignity in their respective fields: aesthetics, philosophy, and political theory. In this reflective spirit, I would like to pose the question, why should we care about torture? And in an effort to respond, I share with you the words of one man who was tortured in detention. He said, "I'll never really get over it. You never can. My family understands well that there are times when I must leave for a while, when all the people, sounds, and smells get too much, and I have to hide in a quiet space. The panic, the voices, the hallucinations, they never leave you. It's a pity you, ICRC, never found me when you were visiting. I remember that you did a lot of good to those others who were in a similar situation, just providing some human contact, and especially the assurance that we were not forgotten, and the hope that it may end." These words speak powerfully to the intense and ongoing suffering that torture causes. Torture is the intentional and direct assault on the dignity of a person. Torture is used in an attempt to humiliate, to dehumanize, and to destroy an individual's dignity and sense of trust. It generates fear and enforces compliance, both in the victim and in the wider community. For survivors of torture, their pain and suffering never ends. Many carry this suffering throughout their lives, struggling to resume and rebuild their lives. Because torture is a direct affront to the core value of human dignity, as perpetration damages families and impacts the social fabric. It also leaves its mark on the perpetrators, and it feeds a cycle of hatred, revenge, and violence. Preventing torture and fighting impunity are crucial to maintaining or setting the foundations for peace and stability. So this is why we care about torture. Every day, my colleagues visit detainees in almost 100 countries around the world. We sit with detainees, we listen, and we take action on their behalf. And we engage the perpetrators of torture and ill treatment and those with the power to stop torture. But this is no easy task, and it brings me to my second question. Are attitudes towards torture changing? As you know, torture remains absolutely prohibited under international law. This legal prohibition is firmly rooted in a fundamental moral principle, but this cannot be taken for granted. Last year, we released the results of a study called People on War. It was a perception survey. We asked some 17,000 people around the world whether they believe in setting limits in situations of conflict. From their responses, it is clear that people are generally against torture. 2/3 of the respondents say that torture is wrong. However, when asked about using torture to obtain information about an enemy, the results showed that compared to the 1999 survey done by the ICRC, fewer people oppose torture today than in the past. These findings are troubling, and we need to reflect on what is driving them. Torture is no longer a dirty secret. It's out in the open, discussed, debated, even shown in movies like Zero. We're faced with a constant stream of gruesome images coming from both war zones and from Hollywood movies. This may be impacting what people think and feel, possibly to the point of indifference toward the idea of torture and torturing. And our political reality may also be fostering this change. 9/11 and the brutality that was allowed to take place in its wake has shown us, yet again, that cruelty and torture can and will resurface, that these are not issues for only non-democratic societies, but are taking place in our own Western, so-called developed neighborhoods. Some current world leaders have stated publicly and recently that torture works, while at the same time social scientists demonstrate that torture is not efficient nor reliable. The political rhetoric of our times openly promotes and encourages fear and demonizes the other. The ICRC has seen an increased use of practices such as coercive interrogation and solitary confinement. The ICRC works in every way we can to prevent and to end the practice of torture, wherever it occurs. To do this, we rely on relays across the globe. We need relevant actors to come together and constantly seek new ways to address the issue. When we speak about torture and the prevention of torture, we speak, of course, about the law, but we must speak as well about training, about civic education, about culture, and about ethics. Last year, we had a conference focusing on the psychology of the perpetrator. This year, we turned to the philosophers to reflect on best ways to influence the toxic discourse on torture. There is an absolute need to strengthen in the minds of people across the globe a rejection of the use of torture. Tonight is about reflecting on these pressing issues, questioning our assumptions, and expanding our thinking. I'm delighted that we are beginning a conversation across the conventional boundaries of our disciplines. We have a lot to learn from you both as thinkers and as educators. And so it is my pleasure to welcome our distinguished guests. I look forward to an evening of frank discussions. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Brad Evans, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's event. I've got a few words which I'm going to give before I introduce the panel and go directly into the questions. It's, of course, a great privilege to be invited here today. And when Oliver Chow, who unfortunately can't be here today due to illness, initially approached me about doing some kind of event to mark this day, I immediately recognized the importance and the intellectual challenge this presented. Torture might be the most perversely intimate of acts upon individuals who are often truly alone. And yet each wound inflicted, every cry silenced, represents another assault on the idea that we might construct a politics with love, compassion, and dignity. We know violence, and especially torture, can seem intolerable to us. And since it is intolerable, our natural reaction is to often look away, not to dwell upon its occurrence. Through our forced exposure and witnessing to violent atrocities, we too can also be traumatized by visual encounters. It can literally scar our imagination. But violence and its more intimate manifestations, like torture, also compel us to think critically about it. Now, I don't subscribe in any way to the notion that humans are just naturally violent. And by that token, I do believe that peace is possible amongst the world of people. But in order for us to ethically develop styles for living that are suited to the 21st century, echoing the challenge set by Walter Benjamin, it is imperative that we develop a critique of violence which does ethical justice to the subject. To bring out the best of us, we have to confront the worst of what humans are capable of doing to one another. In short, there is a need to confront the intolerable realities of torture in this world. So how do we do this? Well, we need to begin by recognizing that violence is not some abstract concept or a theoretical problem. It represents a violation in the very conditions that constitute what it means to be human as such. Violence is always an attack upon a person's dignity, their sense of selfhood, and their future. It is nothing less than the desecration of one's position in this world. It is a denial and an outright assault on those very qualities which we claim make us considered members of a social fellowship and a shared union called civilization. In this regard, we might say that torture is both an ontological crime, insomuch as it seeks to destroy the image we give to ourselves as valued individuals, and a form of political ruination, which stabs at the heart of human togetherness that emerges from an ethical desire for worldly belonging. Now, it is somewhat obvious to us as well that what defines the human condition is not simply that we live with this capacity to be wounded. We have the capacity to think and imagine better worlds. So this is what I would argue is really at stake here. To accept violence is to normalize the wounds that tear apart the bodies of the living. And that is why torture is so pernicious, especially as it becomes justified and more socially acceptable. Through the subtle intimacy of its performance, it brings everything into its orbit, such that the future can only appear to us as something that is violently fated. Every scar left upon the body of the individual is another cut into the flesh of the earth. But there is also no point in discussing violence unless we believe that there is something to be done about it. If violence undoes the very idea of humanity, we must learn to undo violence. But such undoing is not going to come about from the voice of a single individual, and certainly not a single academic. Violence, like this type of event shows, demands a conversation with somber and honest reflection. And it's with that conversational ethos in mind that we envisage the form for this event. And I should also say that when Oliver asked me to help develop the speaker list for this event, the three persons whose names immediately sprung to mind were Elaine, Simona, and Jays. So it's truly wonderful that they all agreed to be here today. Not only do I believe that their work on violence has really pushed forward our thinking in the most pioneering and ethically sensitive ways, despite the bleakness of the topics they all engage with, I think it's fair to say that none of them lose sight of the transformative potential of affirmative ideas. And it's with this in mind, it's with great pleasure that I can introduce Professor Elaine Scarry from Harvard University, Professor Simona Forti from the University of Eastern Piedmont, along with distinguished Professor Jay Bernstein from the New School for Social Research in New York. So in terms of the format, what we will propose is we're going to run through a set of 3 questions, which we're going to take in turn, and each of those will take about 15 minutes to go through. And then we want to leave good sufficient time for audience participation in terms of questioning, because as I say, this is about trying to create a dialogue that ultimately deals with some very difficult and politically challenging questions. So in terms of the first question, we've structured this as simply, what is your perspective on torture? So I will initially address that to Elaine.
We agreed to come, or I agreed to come, and I think all of us agreed to come because it's a great honor to be here. And my only reluctance to come was knowing that there were many people here who knew as much or much more about this subject than I did. And in the hours that we've been here, that's been confirmed by conversation with people. My own work began with people who were tortured in the 1970s in many different countries. But when I speak right now, I'm going to refer, for specific examples, to the kind of torture that has been practiced by my countrymen in the United States in the most recent years, since that's part of what we're trying to address. Torture consists of a physical act, the infliction of pain, and a verbal act, the interrogation. And there's a tremendous puzzle about the way in which our moral reactions change depending on whether we're looking at the physical act or the verbal act. In terms of the physical act, almost everyone would have the kind of description or response that Mary introduced tonight, a feeling that there's a self-evident wrong occurring of a very grave sort. The physical pain that's inflicted is quite horrifying. That's certainly been true in recent years with Abu Zabida being waterboarded 83 times and Khalid Mohammed 183 times, with Zubaydah being kept in a coffin box for 299 hours, and then in a smaller box that was 24 inches by 2.5 feet by 2.5 feet for 29 hours. Then there are many other instances of that. The physical pain that was inflicted was so great that the obscene definition given by President Bush's Office of Legal Counsel that I think you've probably all heard, that we'll only consider it torture if the pain approaches the condition of organ failure or death. Well, even by that definition, the United States committed torture, since at least 4 people died in the process of receiving those very practices that I just described. But what then happens with the interrogation? We know for centuries that torture produces nothing but false information. Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century said that, and almost every report has shown the same thing. Most recently, the US Senate has a long, long report showing that every claim made by the CIA and by the presidency is false. It goes through the Karachi plot, untrue. The airliners plot, untrue. The second wave plot, untrue. And on and on and on. The dirty bomb plot, untrue. It's not that there weren't any of these plots. It was that no useful information about them came from the act of torture. Given that that is the case, that over centuries and over all these different countries, you have that continuous coupling of the interrogation with the physical pain. What is the interrogation doing there? And it's clearly not getting information. What it's doing is this: it's allowing a kind of amplification of the distance between the prisoner and the torturer. The prisoner's body is getting bigger and bigger. It's filling the world. And the torturer is completely immune and essentially has no body for in that situation itself. And meanwhile, the victim, the prisoner's voice is disappearing. And if you doubt that that's part of what the torturer wants to bring about, rather than the opposite, having the voice give information, just look at the Senate report and the number of times the CIA notes that what was coming out of Zubaydah's mouth was a bubble, or what was coming out of Khalid Mohammed's mouth was water. And the phrase is used, he expressed water when we pressed on his diaphragm. So what is it that's happening? And what is happening is that a kind of mimesis, or a kind of pageantry, a display of power is created by transferring the very real attributes of bodily pain into the highly questionable attributes of political power. I say that because we know that the times when torture is used correspond exactly with the times in which a regime has self-doubt about whether it is a legitimate regime. Bruno Bettelheim long ago noted that in the German concentration camps, periods in which the prisoners were tortured or killed varied with times in which they were comparatively well treated, depending on whether Germany was winning or losing the war. It was when they were losing the war that they began to inflict tremendous, grave bodily damage. And in our country, obviously, the humiliation of a country not being able to defend itself, and I mean that very literally, our Pentagon, the major body of defense, not only couldn't defend the United States, it couldn't even defend the Pentagon, which was hit that night. So the last manifestation of this that I'll just for the moment stress is that there is a kind of verification of the idea of creating a spectacle among the participants of the regime. In the 70s, in the fact that in Chile, the torture room was called the blue lit stage. In Vietnam, it was called the cinema room. In the Philippines, it was called the production room. And in the United States, the CIA made 91 films of the prisoners tortured, films that they have since destroyed. But what they were filming it for their own purposes. You and I and all of us in this room know about Abu Ghraib because it was all being photographed and even being put on computers in the prison. And only one soldier at the time, Joe Darby, saw that in order to support the international and national prohibitions on torture, that had to be reported immediately.
So I thought I'd start our conversation with a reminder. The reminder is that the revulsion against torture is brand new. That for centuries, people thought torture was not only legally right, but morally right. So between the 11th century and the middle of the 18th century, every single European nation had torture as both part of its law of evidence and as a part of its law of punishment. Why? Well, the simple reason was they had a really great idea at the beginning of the 11th century, namely for people who committed capital crimes, crimes deserving the death penalty, you required either 2 eyewitnesses or a confession. This is a great standard. It so happens that most murderers don't commit murder before 2 eyewitnesses, and they don't confess. So they built into the law of evidence the idea that even if there was the most minimal amount of circumstantial evidence, you could torture someone in order to get more evidence. And then if they denied it later, you could torture them again. So torture was at the core of law. It belonged to law, and it belonged to the authority of this head of state. So torture, when it became the moment of penalty, were not scenes of horror, but scenes of festival and celebration. Everyone getting together to what punish means, right? Pain means punishment, and punishment is something that you owe the community for what you did wrong. So up until the 18th century, torture was part of our culture. So the revulsion against torture is brand new. What happened in the 18th century? A lot of argument, but one thing for sure happened, namely the notion of pain lost its religious connotations. It used to be thought if you were in pain, you deserved to be in pain. You must have done something wrong. Suddenly pain simply became suffering, what no human body should have to undergo. And suddenly, rather than thinking of pain as something owed to the community, pain became a site of of revulsion. And this changed the very idea of punishment. In a famous phrase, Foucault says, physical pain, the pain of the body itself, was no longer the constituent element of punishment. From being, this is a great phrase, from being the art of intolerable sensations, punishment became an economy of suspended rights. We shifted from pain to the suspension of rights. So the first thing I want to say is what that means is, for the first time in history, in the middle of the 18th century, the government was not allowed to touch the body. This is transformative for our very idea of law, that you may put someone in prison, take away their freedom, but you cannot touch their body. Why is this important? Because the very idea of human dignity depends on this idea that a person's body is their own. So the first thought I want comes from one of my heroes, a man named Alberto Mora. And he's a hero because he was a lawyer for the Navy under Bush, and he refused to sign the document that would let the Bush administration torture. And Alberto Mora said, it is very simple. Where cruelty exists, law does not.
I am a political theorist, a political philosopher, and over the last few years, I have worked trying to rethink the link between power and evil. And of course, about this link, torture emerged as one of the extreme example of the link between power and evil. So, of course, a lot depends on what you consider to be power. There are a lot of definitions about power, but there are mainly two, let's say, traditions or currents. So, power is conceived as some coercion, some form of coercion, and if you follow this line, of course, torture is an example, an extreme example of the modality through which power works. Of course, in this extreme example, by torture, power as coercion is all the reality. But in a way, it's still an example of power. Power when conceived as coercion, and in institutional terms, power conceived as sovereignty. And if we follow the other tradition, that power is something different from domination, and just to quote the two names I have in mind, Hannah Arendt on the one side and Michel Foucault on the other, on this they share the opinion that power and freedom go together, and domination is different from power. And when there is domination, power exhausts its own energy. And so, but what is interesting is that for both the tradition, torture is an example of the coincidence between let's say, a frozen image of power, when power is frozen into domination and power stops to circulate, and for the other tradition, yes, torture is an image of evil, but of that evil that in a way is implied in power. I hope I was clear enough. For both the tradition, torture is an image of evil. The torture as general phenomenon, the scene itself that torture portrays. So I would say that snapshot of the relation between the one who tortures and the one who is tortured, and is always taken as an emblem of evil. And why? Because on the one hand, you have an omnipotent subject, the torturer, who monopolizes all the power, and on the other side, you have a totally impotent subject who is reduced to a thing, to a res, to a thing. And so let's start from here and ask ourselves why torture, although in a way justified by institutions, stately institutions, yes, although this, torture is for everybody, and at least for people who do philosophy, the image of evil.
So the second question we're now moving on to is, how does your understanding of this problem connect, or should I perhaps rephrase this and say, how does this connect or allow us to critique the problematic of torture today?
I spoke earlier about this kind of tremendous creation of a verbal fiction and the way in which the torturer builds a bigger and bigger world. Your world is nothing. You don't even care about your son, whose picture I've got on the wall there, who stands to be harmed if you don't tell me something. Compare that with all this huge world map that I, as the torturer, control. And just as a shorthand, if you think about the part played by the ticking bomb in the last 17 years in the 21st century, on television programs, in the torture room, in the legal classroom, one of our major constitutional lawyers, Alan Dershowitz, day in and day out, telling rooms full of students, with many more students than are here tonight, that are more populated than this room, that the ticking bomb is the occasion that you should think about when you're thinking about torture. And even we know from the contemporary law case going on in the United States of the two physicians who devised the torture plans, that they were told if they stopped, there might be a nuclear holocaust to pay. It's a preposterous argument, and if I had time, I would just use all that time to show you, which perhaps you already know, what a preposterous fabrication that is. But just to go to what we have to do today, I think that the reason that torture must be prosecuted has three bases. First, the absolute harm of torture to the individual prisoners, and that is absolute. And we know, again, that the Geneva Conventions and the Convention Against Torture both require prosecution. They make it, it's not discretionary. You are obligated to carry out that prosecution. But even beyond the fact of the prisoner's pain is the fact that we know that this location of inflicting pain is the kind of bedrock of all other law. The legal philosopher Jeremy Waldron says, it's the line in the sand. If you aren't clear about this, there aren't any laws you can be clear about. And we can illustrate this by the time of President Bush's administration when he not only allowed to be violated the prohibition on torture, but the tiny number of stipulations in the Army manual, the Navy manual, and the Air Force manual about the few things you can't do in war without being guilty of treachery or war crimes. And those are violating the Red Cross or the white flag. They include flying a false flag, and they include posting reward signs announcing wanted dead or alive or assassination. In our country, the United States, did all three of those during the Iraq War. But that's just an example of the way in which once you begin to equivocate on torture, the other things begin to equivocate too. And those are things where, though they should be absolute, they're a little less stark and clear than torture. So if you give up this one, you begin to give them up, all of them up. So just taking Jeremy Waldron's formulation, the rule of law, the whole structure begins to flounder if you give up on torture. And then there's a third reason, and that is that if you permit this, what results is cognitive anarchy. And cognitive anarchy, a kind of mental confusion, widespread mental confusion, is everywhere present in the documented torture cases in the United States. We know from the early FBI study that was done of CIA torture that when FBI officials would go into prisons in these various dark sites, they knew what they were allowed to do and what they couldn't do, but they were being told that the CIA and other high officials had licensed this, and they report honestly not knowing what the rules were. And that kind of disarray shows up in many other places, even in the Supreme Court, in the law cases, Raoul versus Bush and Hamden versus Rumsfeld. The Supreme Court justices in the transcripts kind of look like they're hitting their heads saying, am I talking to someone from Mars that I have to explain that the Geneva Conventions, that you're not allowed to break them without committing a war crime? Do I have to explain what a court is by saying a court is, as defined by the International Red Cross, a standing court that's in your country? That, again, is a sign of cognitive anarchy. And when you take that and now project it across the US population, and no doubt populations in other countries, but I can only report on what I see in my own country, the disarray is truly huge. And part of that is that the people giving these stories, Bush, Rumsfeld, Cheney, Ashcroft, are people who have a great deal of authority. If I lie, that's a bad thing, but my influence only goes so far. If the President of the United States lies, or the Vice President lies, it has what in Speech Act theory is called transmissible authority. People begin to repeat it across millions of people, and you therefore have a tremendous disarray. And you end up with the situation that Mary referred to in the People on War study by the Red Cross, with more and more people uncertain about whether torture is wrong. Or the Pew polls have also verified this fact, that more and more people are uncertain about whether torture is wrong. So it has to be prosecuted because it's the rule of law, the Geneva Conventions, Conventions against torture, because all of law will flounder if you don't preserve that, and to try and redress and get back this phenomenon of cognitive anarchy. And let me just say, there are lots of explanations for President Trump in our country, but one of them is cognitive anarchy. If your countrymen have gotten to the state where they don't know whether to say this act of torture is right or wrong, then you can actually end up with a president who could look at the color of walls here and announce that they're red, because the language has become so unanchored from physical truth, and that's where we are today.
I want to pick up something that Mary said. Jean Amaret said it as well. Someone who is tortured stays tortured. And Mary also said something that should actually be very disturbing to us. Torture destroys dignity. And I just want to give, in 5 minutes if that's possible, an explanation of how human dignity can be destroyed. Because that is one of the puzzles about torture. Why, in all legal systems, torture is worse than killing. It's worse than killing because if someone enters my home and they're attacking me, I'm allowed to kill them in self-defense. I'm not allowed to take them into my basement and torture them. Torture is worse than killing. So torture typically is thought to have 4 elements, the first of which is something that Elaine's work brought starkly to our vision, namely, it isolates the victim. They lose their connection to the world, pain becomes all. Second, at that moment, they become overwhelmed and above all, helpless, both physically helpless and morally helpless. They have no defenses. Thirdly, they're terrorized. They're terrorized because there is an outside, but it's there only as a source of pain and injury. And fourth, and most oddly, they are humiliated and degraded. They lose their standing as a human being. They lose their standing as someone with dignity. They have no intrinsic worth. They are broken. That's what it means to break someone. And the question is, how can someone be broken? So torture is intimate, like love, but it's inversion. The other is not irreplaceable as in love, but a wholly disposable being. And my thought behind this structure is something like the following. I think we have to think of human beings as having, their bodies have 2 aspects or 2 axes. A voluntary axis, we are in control of our bodies, we will things, we do things. In fact, when we're in control of our body, we don't even notice it's a body at all. We simply play the sonata on the piano. But we also have an involuntary body, the body that sweats and belches and feels pain and laughs out of control and weeps and cries and urinates, lactates, gets pregnant. So we actually are an involuntary body and a voluntary body put together. And the question is, how are they put together? They're put together by social rules. Every society does it differently. Every society tells you where you are related to how you are to relate your involuntary body to your voluntary body. Torture is about separating the involuntary body from the voluntary body. In torture, the torturer takes over the position of volition or will, and the victim is left with merely their involuntary body. They are left merely with their pain. They cannot imagine an end to their pain because they no longer have a control over their body. If you want to think about how torturous this is, just remember that teacher you had who said you couldn't go to the bathroom. Suddenly, the most natural human function is out of your control. Your body will do what it will do, and your relationship to it is taken away. Torture destroys your dignity because it destroys the relationship of you to yourself. It destroys, and once that happens to you, you know it can happen. And once you know it can happen, then you know you're not sure who to trust ever again. So the reason what we call PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, is that loss of trust in the world, that knowledge that your relationship to your own body is in the hands of another. Torture exploits that fact and makes it absolute. Hence, it is the paradigm of moral harm.
I think that what Jay just told us is one of the deepest points that philosophy has reflected upon. No? When Marie was talking about the unspeakable, I think that it has to do with a sort of crime, the crime of torture, that it's not only a moral injury, but we could also call it an ontological crime. An ontological crime because it's not just a voluntary act against somebody, but, and in this respect, it's quite curious that on the one side, philosophy elaborated such a sensibility against this kind of new form of being a victim, and on the other side, institutions, some sovereign states, are rehabilitating torture. No, it's a very contradictory and curious fact. But what is an ontological crime? Why ontological crime? Because together with an absurd amount of psychic and physical suffering, for example, the 20th century and this mechanistic, cold, bureaucratic operating about dehumanization and depersonalization brought about a sort of new form of life. If you read through the testimonies of the 20th century of the camps, you understand that for them there was something unthinkable, because as if they were discovering a new form of life which is not given with the given world, in a way. And if somebody of you, maybe many of you, have read Primo Levi, If This Is a Man, I think that there is one of the most sensitive, philosophical, not only literary, but also philosophical testimony of this new form of life brought about by tortures and the annihilation in the camps. Primo Levi speaks about the Muslim. The Muslim was the prisoner reduced to the involuntary body, no? With automatic reaction. It was nailed to his flesh, to his body. And of course, this is not given with the given word, because we are not only in the word, but we are of the word. We are open to others. We have a lot of habits that repair us from injuries, but that kind of new form of life was a sort of denaturated victim without any kind of possibility to appeal to something else than different from their own pain. So this is a sort of new form of life. And this destruction of uniqueness, of this destruction of uniqueness as integrity, we could say, it was an ontological crime. Because the victim becomes a thing, okay? In total possession of another force, and you cannot respond. So I think that if we think about this and we consider this kind of rehabilitation of torture as if it were just another power of the state, of the states, so you can measure the absurdity of this.
On to the last question, and obviously we've dealt with how do we critique torture. But I think one of the most pressing questions that we also face today is the question of education. And how do we actually educate about torture while doing proper ethical justice to the subject? So I'd like to ask you for reflections on this, if possible.
We need both education and prosecution. And I think that prosecution is the strongest avenue of education. Once people see that a president or a highly placed secretary in the administration cannot authorize torture, an understanding that this is a prohibited act will follow quickly. But it's also the case that if you educate, you increase the chance that prosecutions will come about. As I've said, we now have a case in the United States where the physicians involved in designing some of the torture room will be on trial. But there are also people higher up who had direct hand in the torture, where we have memos written in their hand licensing using dogs and nakedness and people's need to go to the bathroom in elaborate ways. So here's what I think we should think of the map, or one way of thinking of the map. We know from the Pew polls, which I think are even more pessimistic than the Red Cross polls for people on war, that roughly 50% of people think that it's okay to sometimes torture or even to often torture. And a smaller number, it's now at about 43%, I think, still understand that it must never or only very rarely be used. That's the way the Pew poll formulates it. Now, about the 50% who think that it's okay to torture, a lot of work needs to be done. But even in the sphere of those who understand that it must never be practiced, there, I believe, is a lot of education work that needs to be done. Because if you say what percent of those people will actually stand up and take a hand in decrying torture, the number is not very high. I was present at one victims group protest that was entitled, "Where's the Outrage?" This was people who had conducted by victims of torture. And they cited there a quotation that's on the Holocaust Museum in Washington that said, you should never be a victim of torture, you should never be a perpetrator of torture, but most of all, you should never be a bystander of torture, which is what many, many people in the population are now. So if you take this 50% of people willing to be bystanders, say how many of them will stand up against it, and ask yourself, why won't the others take a stand? And I think that there are two reasons that are complicating or making it hard for people to take a stand. One is, and this may sound crazy to you, so some of us were talking about it before our session began tonight. In universities, some people who see that torture is wrong don't say anything about it because they think it's just an obvious intellectual problem. Like, it's self-evident that torture is wrong, so I want to work on something interesting. Don't make me work on something that's just self-evident. But imagine how that would stand up to any abysmal practice of the past. Imagine if you learned that people didn't speak out against the Holocaust because they thought it was too intellectually obvious, you would say that that was a really depraved argument. I think the second reason that inhibits people from helping with this is the phenomenon that has been pointed out of the kind of altruistic punishers. That people who want punishment for something like torture will themselves suffer adversity for it. They won't get any benefit for it. Whereas the people who, in this kind of economic analysis, are called the free riders, will get the benefit of it without suffering the harm of it. Cass Sunstein is one of our contemporary legal philosophers who points out that those who speak out don't get any benefit. They usually are punished by society for speaking out. I think that when, in the United States, as we moved into the 2008 election, many good-hearted people felt it was better just to elect our way out of it by electing a good man. And they didn't understand that if you do that, you're saying that it's just a matter of president's discretion. If this president wants to torture, he does. If the next President Obama doesn't want to torture, he doesn't, we hope. If the next President Trump wants to torture, he does. So you can't just elect your way out of it. But they also realize that punishing people feels awful, whereas forgiving people and moving on feels good. And people need to understand that that feeling of well-being they come from, that accompanies the feeling of saying don't prosecute, is not coming from any genuine moral nobility. It's coming from the feeling of well-being, from not having to carry out this aversive act of upholding the law.
So I think I want to add a third, more depressing reason. I think my hunch is we three actually agree on what might be called a communicative conception of torture, that severe pain and suffering communicate limitless power on one side and the victim's absolute worthlessness on the other. And the question is, why isn't that thought more appalling than it is? Why do we continue to think it may be okay? And the reason I want to add to it is because of gender violence. I think that we accept rape too readily and therefore accept torture too readily. So just the obvious reminder, first of all, of course, rape is a means of torture. It has been used always as a means of torture. But the question you should ask is, how come rape can be used as a means of torture? And I think the answer is because rape is a form of torture. So I think that rape commits the same kind of moral injury against the victim as torture does. I think it's also a communication to the victim, namely that she is helpless and without power and also worthless. That is, has not the same standing as the male. And I take it that societies in disintegration, we find a tremendous outburst of rape. Why? Because I think for people who are losing their sense of worth and authority, there's always someone who is worse off, namely the woman. So rape is I want to say, the mundane version of torture. And some argue, so the thought that rape is torture and should be said to be torture is an argument that Catherine McKinnon has been making for nearly 20 years. And some people argue, but look, torture is rare and rape happens all the time, about 60 or 70,000 times a year in the UK. I think that's a bad argument. It allows us to say because something happens all the time, it should never happen. So I think until we change our attitudes to gender violence, we're not going to be able to find torture to be the absolute it needs to be. We have to recognize that the reason why rape has continued on is because it's domestic, it's private, it happens out of sight. And we've let this happen for centuries and centuries and centuries. And yet, right, so I think part of the education has to be about violence against women.
I would like to pick one thing that Brad spoke about at the beginning, that so to be a better person, you have to know the worst. And of course, that's the reason why we as teachers have to insist on talking about this issue. And let the young people know that the worst is not only morally the worst, but it's also something that is against the human condition, let's say. That in a way you cannot be a god, a sovereign of the other bodies, as the torturer can believe to be, but also that a human being, also the worst criminal on earth, is never a thing. Okay, and so this double image is against a condition, a human condition. And the second thing I try to do with my students and also to younger people is to educate to complexity. And which sounds so banal, but it's quite difficult to educate to complexity. And what I mean to educate to complexity, that on the one hand, we are plural in the world, and our identities are related to the identities of others, and so we cannot stand alone, stand by ourselves. But at the same time, that we have not to dissolve into a collective entity, that we have to struggle for our capacity of judging. Why? Because many of these new demons, these new bureaucratic torturers, these new figures, these new perpetrators acted as they did, not only because of their delirium of omnipotence, but they acted as they did out of conformity, out of, in a way, docility, let's call it, normality, in the sense of following the hegemonic norm of their own society at the time. And so complexity in this sense, to recall that we are made by others, and so we are not autonomous in ourselves, but at the same time that you have to struggle, not to lose oneself in the group, and not to, let's say, to lose your responsibility just because an overwhelming group is ordering you to do something.
Just a couple of points which I'd like to maybe bring it all together, and I think a couple of shared points which come across. And the first actually concerns the question, what is pain? And it strikes me that from what's been discussed here, there's a real important discussion taking place, first of all, about what we might call the subjective dimensions to torture. And that subjective dimensions to torture gives rise to what Michel Foucault would call a regime of truth. And there's a regime of truth around torture which seeks to legitimate its very performativity. So that, to me, is an important point, but also how we can then bring that back to the very real, visceral reality of torture, that it's actually not subjective, it's subjecting. And the subjecting nature of torture, the way in which it gives rise actually to a lifetime of abuse, and a lifetime of abuse which is an assault on a person's dignity. So I think how we can get the debate away from the subjective to the subjecting seems to me, as first of all, a very important move. The second point, which I find fascinating, has come through in all three responses, is this point about confession and what is actually being confessed in the act of torture. Now, as we know, there's very little to be gleaned from the person who is so-called confessing, but maybe we're coming at the problem of confession wrong in that regard, but perhaps there's more actually being confessed about the regime engaging in torture. So maybe we can ask the question, what is the regime confessing about itself when it engages in torturous acts? Well, if we follow Hannah Arendt, which a number of you have raised, it's that it has no power. It has no ability to transform people's ideas. It simply has to rely upon violence to get its way. So that maybe we can use torture then as the surest diagnostic of any political regime to ask whether it is politically impotent or not. A third point, which I find is also interesting, is this question of the spectacle. And torture as a spectacle of violence, which, as we know, is very intimate and very symbolic. And again, I would think, one of the questions we need to ask ourselves, first of all, is, okay, what is the message that's being communicated? But more importantly, how there is no innocent bystander. We know with violence that it brings us into its orbit. But it is incumbent upon all of us to make a position and a stand upon this. Because if you don't, if you object from it, then you are objecting. And I think that is another point that we have to deal with the burdens of that violence. And fourthly and finally is obviously, given the setting that we're at as well, is the question of the legal and ethical interplay and how we understand the question of legality and the question of ethics around this. Now, on the one hand, I think we can start with already established positions of international law, which already map out the very idea that torture is wrong. But we also need continuous ethical commitment to argue that we need to pursue the question of persecution, but also the very idea that we can imagine politics better and differently in the 21st century. And that, to me, is also one of the fundamental ethical challenges. So with those points in mind, I would like to open it up to questions.
Hello, my name is Steve Barella. I'm a research and teaching fellow at the Global Studies Institute at the University of Geneva. I want to begin by thanking you very much for all the presentations. They were very enlightening. And my question has to do with the fact, first, is if all of you are aware of the research and practice that is emerging right now that actually was started by the Obama administration from the high-value detainee interrogation group. And there was a scientific research has been put forward about looking at what sorts of legal interrogation is the most effective. And the results are quite interesting in the sense that everything is pointing towards the rapport-based as some of that is known. A lot of the information before has been anecdotal about torture not working, and at this point, this is the first time I've seen it actually put into empirical data analysis. And so I'm curious to know if you are aware of this information and if that is something you see as a positive avenue. We have talked about how the Obama administration has fallen down on prosecutions, but this is a different avenue that they have pursued, and I'm curious to know your thoughts on that.
No, I know in detail the Senate report, which I wouldn't categorize as anecdotal. I mean, it really goes through every single claim, and there are thousands of claims in the CIA documents, and investigates them, and shows one by one that they are untrue. Now, the public now has only the 500-page version of this, whereas there's a 6,000-page version, and maybe that would show something different. But no, I don't know the details of this work. I know that and this is anecdotal, that in every case where officers from the FBI have described their own work of interrogation, they have stressed that they only got information when it was non-coercive. I mean, every act of questioning has some degree of coercion, but only when there was no physical force or no physical pain did they get useful information. So I will welcome looking at the statistical analysis of that.
Yeah, just to carry on. So professional interrogators all opt for rapport-based, and it's important because it is hoped that interrogators will be trained in rapport-based rather than trained in the other. That's why it's important. The weakness or the difficulty is a simple gap. When Trump said, yeah, I think we ought to do some waterboarding, General Mattis, who knows the very information you were talking about, said, no, give me a pack of cigarettes and a beer, and I'll get a lot more information. The people in authority are struck by their imagination rather than the facts. And we have to deal with a problem of the imagination. And part of the way I think torture gets a grip is to imagine what you would do if you were tortured. And I think that, like weak regimes, weak individuals who know that they would spill all the beans the moment they also are people who are in power. So dealing with torture is not merely dealing with good reports and good institutional practices. It's actually trying to cope with the human imagination. Torture is deep in the human imagination, as is cruelty. And I agree with Elaine, the blockades about this have to be institutional. It has to be about laws, it has to be about prosecutions, it has to be about training, it has to be about education. If you leave it to the quiet, if you leave it to mere people's imagination.
I'm Marina, I'm in the ICRC. It's quite to do with cognitive anarchy, which I really liked the concept, as well as the compliance with the hegemonic norm of society, rather from the sense of the interrogator. And I've met several who have been very open about what interrogation entails for them, and includes torture, but to the point that they say, well, it's so systematic now that even if the confession is obtained in the first 5 minutes, it'll still continue because this has become the norm. And even those who are trying to combat it, and Mary, when she introduced this evening, she used a quote from a man who I met myself, who had himself been tortured and was now part of the authorities and trying to combat it. And any step he took, he could not get past the compliance around him to what had become an accepted norm. And I wonder how does one go backwards, particularly if it's become so widespread as to become normalized, let's say.
Yes, that's the tragedy. That's the tragedy, that you are following a procedure and you stop and you don't stop, even if you, in a way, accomplished what you were meant to do. And I think that this is the new normality of evil, I would say, okay? That you don't even perceive what you are doing For example, the great torturer of the past, think about Torquemada, in a way. He met a single person in front of him, even if in the fervor, in the fanaticism. But of course, he didn't follow an handbook in a way. And so you cannot, if you follow an handbook, you cannot perceive that you are committing a crime in a way. Maybe you asked me something else, I don't know if.
Yeah, well, I heard the problem, of course, as normalization. And how do you break out of normalization? And you said something, I know, about your own work. And I think that the hint of how you break out of the normalization is not to think about it as, how do I influence this institution? It has to begin with paradigms of good instances, of strong models that then become benchmarks. It seems to me you're never going to convince a local institution to change unless there's a model somewhere else that's working a whole lot better. So what's needed is if we could get all countries to look at prisons the way Norway does, prison practices would change. If we could get all countries to adopt, right, interrogational procedures that were non-torturous, that would require some deep institutional change somewhere that had the power to project. So I'm not a great believer in interventions here and there. I think norms tend to build up by paradigms being built up. And I think that's where the best hope is to hope that somewhere, not by election, but by an understanding of human dignity and human rights, somewhere another model emerges that has enough power to project out.
You know, just going back to the point about the imagination, it's always that the imagination is limited. We have difficulty imagining other people. Even lovers often don't know as much as they should about their partner. And certainly, if your neighbor works on the night shift and you work on the day shift, you don't know anything. And then the problem is even worse if it's somebody in a country far away. Right now, the way North Koreans are talked about in the United States, you would think that it was going to be okay to use a nuclear weapon. There's just like no attempt. Here's the amazing thing about laws, whether national or national. They say, it doesn't matter whether you can imagine Syrians or not. There's certain things you're not allowed to do. It doesn't matter whether you can imagine North Koreans. There are certain things you can't do. I mean, it's a direct address to the problem of the imagination. We all have to work for finding better ways of educating our own imaginations, both in the statistical realm and the anecdotal realm. But we also have to realize that there are certain ways of addressing things that take it out of our hands, whether we can imagine or not, and simply say, you can't do these things, whether or not you can imagine the other people.
Which is the purpose of law.
Which is the purpose of law.
Thank you. This has been very interesting. You've said many things which are true, but which are not necessarily new. For example, but it's very good to repeat them. Making the victim a thing, not a person anymore, but that's exactly what the Einsatzgruppen were told. The Untermensch were exactly, they weren't human, they were subhuman, therefore they could be tortured, they could be killed, they could be disposed of. That, using rapport for effective interrogation, well, there's a very good book, not many people know it, called The Interrogator, about the Luftwaffe captain who used to interrogate. He never touched anybody, he got the best information anybody did. I'm sure you know about him, he's not very well known. But I'd like to come back. We've said laws, education, bringing people to court, and I'd like to throw back this question. You said, where's the outrage? Indeed, but throw it back at you. And on the U.S. scene, since we've mentioned the U.S. scene, where is the outrage about Abu Ghraib? Where's the outrage about the people tortured at Guantanamo? I've been in many countries in the Middle East, not just Arabic countries, where they say the Americans are not only criminals because they torture, they're also stupid. The best posters for recruitment, they gave them to us, the posters from Abu Ghraib. We know this, yes. I've said, so how can torture be sort of funneled and sort of say, no, this cannot be done, there should be something. There's no outrage. In the US, there's no outrage even in the rest of the world. The posters are there. We mentioned this before. Lindy England got 3 years of prison because of the stupid thing she did to put an Iraqi on a leash. That was stupid. She shouldn't have done it. But she was just following, not precise order, but following exactly what was the thing to be done. Go on, it's very good. We're getting information that way. Break them down. Was anybody convicted? Did anybody go to court? Did Rumsfeld go to court? Did Bush go to court? Of course not. Is there any chance of them ever being prosecuted? Not a snowball's chance in hell. So as long as there's no outrage about torture, it's very easy for people to say, well, you know, it can't be that bad. I mean, nobody was prosecuted for Guantanamo. Nobody will be prosecuted for Guantanamo. Not to mention prosecution in India, prosecution for Chechnya or anything else.
So where is the outrage?
Okay. So first of all, I think there's a little more outrage than you said, particularly at the moment in January 2004 when the Abu Ghraib pictures were revealed. I basically agree with what you said, but certainly there are attempts to prosecute. We did have Arar versus Ashcroft, which unfortunately the court turned down on the basis of national security. So the verbal fiction comes forward, even though Arar is a Canadian, a Syrian Canadian. He had nothing to do with anything. He is completely innocent and was kept for a year in a 3-foot by 6-foot by 7-foot room. Now, the good news is that after the court turned that down, the court in the second district in the United States, en banc, that is the 12 judges together, decided sua sponte, meaning that without any request by the defense attorneys, to retry the case. They felt an error had been made. The bad news is they came up with the same conclusion because Obama's administration sent national security, national security, national security, and so they declined to do it. But I'm just using it as an example. We have had a case against Rumsfeld. Courts refused it. I think people will keep, and the ACLU tried that case and then they asked them to please reconsider. The courts declined, but it's not that people aren't trying. And the attempts are far too sporadic and so far have not succeeded, but it's not that the attempts aren't made. And as for Lindy England, just to make concrete what you said, it's not just that we have higher ups saying those same things. We have Rumsfeld himself signing something saying, use dogs and nakedness, according to Janis Kaprinsky, who was the brigadier general in Abu Ghraib. He hand wrote on that letter, see that this gets done. The man is not punished.
So why no outrage? And I have 3 thoughts. First, racism. As long as racism continues, the other is demonized, the other is not human, there'll be no outrage. Second, why is racism continue? I think the thought of human dignity is actually brand new. It's probably only as new as the UN Declaration in '48. It really has not been a deep concept of the West, although I know people in this room think of it as human rights and dignity. Dignity is a brand new moral concept, and it's not yet doing much work. And it's not yet got, although it does again in certain institutions, it's actually not been used and communicated very effectively. Which leads me to the third thought, right? So without human dignity as a fundamental concept, you're not going to get over the racism problem. You're going to have tribalism because you're not going to have outrage at the destruction of the human. And then I think the third thing, the one I mentioned, is without that notion of human dignity, you're also not going to have the thought that where there is cruelty, there is no law. So people think of law as fundamentally an instrument of sovereign power. And that's a terrible vision of law. we don't get over that vision of law until we think of law as that which gives us, supports, holds in place our dignity. And then when we see the law and dignity broken, there would be outrage. We're not there yet.
Dignity, yes, it is as abstract principle, it's quite old, let's say, but it's true that dignity thought together with the body, and the dual, as you mentioned before, the dual dimension of the body is something quite new that we have to start thinking. And it has to do with racism, because our idea of dignity is bound to the shape of a body, of some kind of bodies that carry more dignity and less dignity. So I think in this respect, to think about dignity is quite a new project for us, and connect this to racism and the body.
I was going to ask about, my name is Natalie, I'm also with the ICRC. I was going to ask about the paradigm shift that took place, at least in the West in the 18th century, to lead to the end of a general community acceptance of torture, and whether there would be some interesting insights there in terms of a paradigm shift for today, because it seems like a lot of and I know this as well as you, a lot of the things that we'd all like to see, respect for the law and general dignity and so forth, are not doing the job that we have ideally put them in place to do.
What you think would be the effective vehicles for the outrage, because there have been such vehicles. We have Amnesty, we have a huge number of institutions, we have the courts. So what do we have to do to be effective in expressing our outrage?
I don't know what the answer is to expressing outrage other than prosecution. And I don't know, as somebody who teaches and writes, at earlier times in the earlier parts of the 21st century, tried to write articles, or did write articles that then became a little book, just trying to point out why this was so crucial. And it had little effect. At a certain point, I actually got on the phone and called everyone I knew, urging them to support a movement in the Senate for addressing this, but I don't know the answer. And I think that people who work on this and other forms of injury, like the problem of nuclear weapons, are mystified by why it's as though it takes place on a frequency that, it's as though we're speaking on a frequency that people don't have the receptor for. And you kind of keep trying to find a new frequency on which to say it in the hope that it'll become audible. But so far, it hasn't been locatable.
So outrage, I think, is politically most effective when it's first on the streets. I think people coming out on the streets matters. So that goes to the first question, which is what kind of incident would be the kind of trigger? And one of the things we were talking about earlier amongst ourselves were how the revulsion at torture and its acceptance actually goes in waves. So immediately after, the Second World War, in light of the genocide, people were intensely aware of what happened, and everyone was happy to sign on to the UN, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It seemed like a great start, right? 15 years later, the UN looks kind of weak and helpless, and what's the deal with human rights anyway? So there's an issue here about the relationship between, let's call it, moral experience and moral authority, and how moral experience seems to be one of the deep sources of the authority of moral norms. And we have yet, as a secular culture, to find all the structures that religion had in order to put norms over time, right? So religion was that mechanism, how to, right, reproduce normative authority. As secular cultures, we have not yet, I think, found the kind of mechanisms required. Although, again, law and the courts are the place where we should be thinking hardest.
So, outrage and indignation have to become something that push us really to gather together, not to keep them private. And I think that this is one of the best demonstration of the fact that is quite, let's say, abstract to think of ethics and politics separated. Of course, starting from the moral outrage and ethical outrage, of course, you find in yourself the power, which is not domination, which is power, and power to gather together. And the power, of course, also to educate, because I think at the end of the day, this is one of the few tools we have to express indignation and outrage.
So just in terms of one final comment I want to do before wrapping up, and I actually want to bring this back to the ICRC, and I'm sure all the panelists will agree that when we actually work on violence and you write on violence, it is exhausting, and it's intellectually exhausting, but thankfully as an academic, sometimes you have the time to take a break. One thing the ICRC doesn't have is that luxury. So I think the work really needs to be applauded in its constant commitment to fight against these issues. So with that, I want to end with that, and I hope you can now join me in thanking everybody for their participation.